Great. So we'll just wait a few minutes for people to start trickling in. It just takes a minute for the room to fill.
I love the image you guys have for Pitzer College. I don't know if that is just John's personal one or if that's something with the school has or what. But it's really
yeah, that's our Pro Vita Futuri logo, which is like our Pro Vita Futuri logo. Well, it's the symbol of an orange tree, first of all. And it was created when the school was founded in 1963-64. And it's supposed to be like mindful of the future. Hello, Anthony. How are you doing?
Oh, I'm doing pretty well. How about you?
Great. Thanks for joining us. So Anthony and Austin are here and are going to be helping to field questions by Laura Polito after the talk. And I am just going to go ahead and get started. So I'm Susan Phillips. We are recording this lecture because there's so many people who have emailed me and said, I can't attend, but I really want to watch Laura Polito speaking. We actually record all of our talks. They will be posted on the Redford Conservancy website, as always. I'm Susan Phillips. I'm the interim director of the Robert Redford Conservancy, and it is an absolute pleasure to welcome you today to this talk with Laura Pulido. And Laura works at the intersection of environmental justice and landscape, cultural memory and activism, race and exclusion. She's an absolutely marvelous thinker, speaker, and writer, and we're so pleased to have her here today. Here to introduce her is Austin Dowd, who is part of Sunrise Claremont, which has been hosting this semester a series of events with us about environmental justice. I'm sure that Austin may have a few words to say with you about their interest in that. Before we start, I want to begin by recognizing the work of Director Brenda Sarafe, who's the director of the Conservancy and is on leave. And she's created such a wonderful space for innovative thinkers such as Laura Polito to come and share thoughts and ideas with an audience through events at the Conservancy, and also wanted to recognize the Rockefeller Brothers Fund for sponsoring this event. Thank you so much. What we're going to do is Austin will introduce Laura Polito. Laura Polito will give her talk, and then we'll open it up for questions. But of course, because it's in a webinar format, please use the Q&A to go ahead and write your questions. You can do that, while she's speaking, or you can wait until afterward. And then Anthony Shing and Austin, both of whom are Pitzer first years, will be fielding questions for Professor Polito. I think that's pretty much it. What we're going to aim to do is sort of, the talk will last about 40 to 45 minutes. We'll have about 15 or so minutes of Q&A, and then that'll be it, probably ending right around 5:15 or so. So thank you so much, everyone, for coming. And it's a pleasure to have Austin go ahead and introduce Laura Polito. Take it away, Austin.
Hello, everyone. My name is Austin Dowd, and Anthony and I are members of the Sunrise at the Claremont Colleges, and we're both on the action team. And this semester, we're focusing on a series of talks and lectures related to climate justice. So this afternoon, I'm honored to introduce Laura Polito. Laura Polito is the Collins Chair of Indigenous, Race, and Ethnic Studies and Geography at the University of Oregon, where she studies race, environmental justice, and cultural memory. Her interest in these fields began as a young child, as she was fascinated by maps, landscapes, nature, and places. At the same time, everyday life taught her that we live in a racial, class, and gender hierarchy that shapes our lives. Through her research and teaching, she explores how these processes shape places and how places inform racial and economic processes. She's written numerous books, including Environmentalism and Economic Justice to Chicano Struggles in the Southwest, Black, Brown, Yellow, and Left, Radical Activism in Los Angeles, and A People's Guide to Los Angeles. She has received numerous honors, including the Presidential Achievement Award from the Association of American Geographers and the Ford and Guggenheim Fellowships. And I will let you take it away.
Thank you so much. Okay, so first question is, Can you all see my screen, my PowerPoint? No,
Not yet, not
Sure.
yet.
Thank you. Okay, let me do that. Okay, how's that look?
Coming up, perfect.
Good. Okay, great. Thank you so much for that introduction, Austin. And
Laura,
yes.
sorry. The way that it's formatted is that we see your next slide and click to add notes and all that. So it's not technically in a presentation mode.
Thank you. Let me work on that. No small thing. Let's see. Get out of here.
The way you showed it to us when we did the run through was perfect.
How's that?
Can't see it at all now.
Okay. And I worked really hard on these slides.
Well, and they look beautiful. So yeah, whatever you did, I'm not sure what you did when we shared it prior to the event, but that worked out well.
Okay. How about?
Yes, this is going to be perfect.
Yes.
Yep, that's it. Perfect.
All right. Thank you for your patience.
Of course.
Okay.
Thank you.
Let's see. In September 22, the entire west coast of the US was on fire. The wildfires are not new to the Pacific Northwest region. The fires were unprecedented in terms of their breadth, heat, rapidity, and destruction. This past fall in Oregon, the mix of prolonged drought, high temperatures, highly unusual winds, and a century of fire suppression led to a perfect storm. While the fires themselves were entirely predictable, as scientists have been warning about them for decades, less anticipated was the response from some of the impacted communities. In rural Oregon, especially in communities southeast of Portland, rumors circulated that Antifa and Black Lives Matter activists were deliberately setting fires. Such rumors spread as quickly as the wildfires themselves and created havoc for responders who were trying to evacuate imperiled communities. While attributing historic wildfires to conspiracy theories may seem outlandish, these events offer a window into the US's political landscape. I am particularly interested in the role of denial in this story. The rumors embody two forms of denial: climate denial and the denial of white supremacy. Although scientists provided real-time explanations for the fires, many rural residents rejected them, choosing to believe a false narrative emanating from larger anxieties regarding socialist takeovers, unpatriotic racial justice activists, and domestic terrorism. I argue that driving these fears is a much larger denial of the US as a white supremacist country. While the US has denied white supremacy for centuries, the question of the racial nature of the US was reignited by the Black Lives Matter movement this past spring. While the right opposes Black Lives Matter for many reasons, ultimately, it rejects the movement's assertion that US racism is structural. The US has engaged in all kinds of contortions in order to temporally and spatially contain and minimize racism. Over the past 50 years, the US's dominant racial narrative has gone something like this. Yes, we once had slavery, but it ended with the Civil War. There were some problems in the South with segregation and Jim Crow, but then we had the Civil Rights Movement, and that took care of that. There may still be some isolated problems, but there is not structural racism. Well, ethnic studies scholars have long argued that US racism is indeed structural. Few believed it prior to this past spring after the murder of George Floyd. Finally, millions began seeing the US racism in a new light. This has caused a crisis for the white nation because it challenges the nation's narrative and identity at a fundamental level. I distinguish between the nation and the white nation. The white nation is an imagined political community which sees itself as the central subjects of the larger US nation. This is what Thobani Sunera calls the exalted subjects in her work about Canadian white nation. Thus, in this moment, two crises converge, that of climate change and white supremacy. In today's talk, I first briefly discuss denial and then examine the wildfire rumors in detail. And finally, I consider how the rumors constitute a form of climate and racial denial. Hold on one sec. I got to turn down the heater. You know, it's cold over here still.
No problem, Laura.
My family tells me it's plenty hot down there. Now, let me move on to talking about denial. Stanley Cohen defines denial as assertions that something did not happen, did not exist, is not known, or is not true. I mixed those up. People typically engage in denial when the truth is too disturbing or threatening to be accepted. As you can imagine, denial is a very big place. Kari Norgaard and others suggest it should be understood as a spectrum. There are many forms of denial, as well as numerous motivations for its deployment. For example, people may repress, disavow, lie, or reinterpret the truth. What are increasingly called alternative facts in a post-truth era. At one end of the spectrum is what we can call organized denial. This can be seen in the US in the 1990s, when conservatives led by the Koch brothers organized a campaign to cultivate doubt around climate change, just at the moment as policymakers were beginning to address the problem. The right worked with conservative think tanks and foundations to generate widespread doubt among the US populace as to the accuracy and reliability of climate science. For example, they hosted events that treated the handful of scientists who denied climate change as comparable to the over 90% who accepted it as fact. Treating the two sides as equivalent became the norm in the US media, thereby legitimizing doubt. This, coupled with the far right's ability to exert complete control over the Republican Party in regards to climate change, has blocked any meaningful action at the federal level. Consequently, we lost precious decades in which we could have slowed climate change, thereby mitigating the now horrific scenarios we now face. A little bit of doubt can go a very long way. Donald Trump, as both a candidate and president, engaged in different forms of denial. His denial has included outright lies, partial lies, the ridiculous, as well as deliberate misrepresentations of the facts. For instance, you may recall Trump calling global warming a Chinese hoax, insisting that the climate always changes anyway, thereby precluding the anthropogenic nature of contemporary global warming, and using moments of intense snow and cold as evidence that the planet is not warming. In terms of the West Coast wildfires, Trump blamed it on forest management while refusing to acknowledge global warming. Although not an organized form of denial, this is still extremely powerful given Trump's status. In contrast, the denial articulated by rural Oregonians is more complex and warrants close investigation. Given the sudden onset of the fires, the denial was certainly not premeditated, nor was it a deliberate misrepresentation of the facts comparable to Trump's lies. Residents actually believed that they were being targeted by outsiders, despite the fact that the entire West Coast was in flames. We know they believed it because they were willing to risk their well-being to protect their homes and communities from imagined intruders. This is a different sort of denial, one that may not be entirely conscious, but hardly emerged out of thin air. Fisher, among others, insists that climate deniers are not irrational and that we must be attentive to their worldviews and the social context which produce their denial. Accordingly, I argue that the wildfire rumors are rooted in the larger racial formation. In this historical moment, the rural-urban divide is one of the starkest gaps in the US. The rural communities face many challenges and threats. They have largely opposed efforts to reconsider the role of white supremacy in the US past and present. Although the current racial reckoning began with the murder of George Floyd in this past spring, acknowledging the role of white supremacy and settler colonization has been an ongoing problem for the US for centuries, well before 1776. I argue that denial has been fundamental to the US, as evident in its territory, nation, state, and economy. The US nation has long denied its history of racial violence in order to create and justify itself. Given our longstanding practice of denial, it should hardly be surprising that the US leads the industrial world in climate denial. Denial is central to the national culture. Now, let me now turn to the Oregon wildfires. The beginning of September was warm and sunny in Oregon. Because of tremendous heat and high pressure east of the Cascade Mountains, as well as warm ocean temperatures, an unusual hot, dry wind began blowing into Western Oregon, creating what is called an east wind event. And these were similar to the Santa Anas that you all have down in Southern California, but very unusual up here. Such winds themselves are a mark of global warming. The hot winds, dry lightning, and parched forests quickly caught fire and burned with tremendous intensity. Many, including Trump, argued that insufficient logging caused the fires, as there supposedly was a buildup of fuel on the forest floor. My colleague in geography, Dan Gavin, has labeled this argument the fuels narrative and has shown it is untrue in Oregon because so much of the land that burned was actually privately owned and had been clear cut. This is a group he belongs to, Firefighters United for Safety, Ethics, and Ecology, which conducted their studies on there. Because private forests typically operate as tree plantations, they are characterized by clear cutting and young saplings, which burn quickly, thus enabling the fires to spread at rates that precluded effective firefighting. In contrast, the public lands, characterized by secondary growth forests, were better able to withstand the fires. As the fires spread out of control, evacuation warnings were issued. Some residents received texts, there were news alerts, and some got a knock on the door in the middle of the night. Entire communities such as Talent and Phoenix, Oregon were burned to the ground. Others, such as the Blue River, were partially destroyed. The magnificent Mackenzie River, which is designated as a wild and scenic river and draws thousands every summer, is now surrounded by burnt forests and inaccessible to the public. The air in Oregon and Washington registered as the most polluted on the planet. For almost 2 weeks, residents were confined to the indoors. At the end, over 1 million acres were burned, 40,000 people were displaced, thousands of structures were destroyed, and 9 people were dead. It is important to appreciate the scope of the trauma in order to appreciate why people might promote fantastic rumors as to the cause of the fire. Now, the fires themselves, the rumors started on September 9th and lasted only for a week. They died out as social media platforms took them down. There are several rumors about how the rumors began. One story is that someone heard the acronym BLM, which meant Bureau of Land Management, but they interpreted it to mean Black Lives Matter. Others said that some journalists were misidentified as arsonists. Regardless of the initial source, local residents believe that Antifa and BLM were deliberately setting fires, looting threatened communities, and physically attacking imperiled residents. The rumors gained serious traction. One man who was ordered to evacuate refused to go, stating, "There's already reports that Antifa is in town, going down the streets and looting." Another man facing level 3 evacuation orders said, quote, "I am protecting my city. If I see people doing crap, I'm going to hurt them," unquote. Rumors were not limited to social media and personal texts. A local sheriff promoted them, as did podcast host Joe Rogan, a police association, conservative pundits, and QAnon followers. Perhaps more important than the rumors themselves were the actions that followed. Vigilantes began patrolling threatened and burned communities. They set up illegal checkpoints. Journalists were attacked. People not recognized as community members were held at gunpoint. The breadth and depth of the rumors impacted first responders. Police and sheriff spent precious resources responding to hundreds of rumor-based calls rather than evacuating people and protecting communities. In Clackamas County, southeast of Portland, they reported a 405% increase in calls. Worse, because some residents refused to evacuate, firefighters' lives were further endangered. FBI, police, and sheriff departments all posted messages like this one. FBI Portland and local law enforcement agencies have been receiving reports that extremists are responsible for setting wildfires in Oregon. With our state and local partners, the FBI has investigated several such reports and found them to be untrue. Nonetheless, the rumors persisted until social media platforms began deleting the postings. I want to take a close look at the rumors in one community called Sandy. I'm indebted to Cheyenne Holiday, who collected social media data on the rumors. The data came from YouTube, Parler, Twitter, and Facebook. Sandy is about 30 miles southeast of Portland, close enough to be in its sphere of influence, but far enough to be a distinct rural community. Although my data is drawn from one locale, I have no reason to believe that it is exceptional. I present this story in 4 acts. First, arson is not climate change. 2, Antifa BLM are the arsonists and terrorists. 3, there is a cover-up conspiracy. And 4, you are in denial if you don't believe this. But first, let me review the data itself. There were 2 primary sources that I could discern. First, there were poor quality videos in which there was actually no evidence of illegal activity. Sometimes it was unclear what was happening because of poor quality, but more often there were clear images of, say, a parked car like we see here, and then a nefarious narrative attached to it. In this case, someone says, "Folks, this is real. In Boring, Oregon, 2 people just arrested with axes and gas cans. Shit is getting close. Get locked and loaded." This photo is from the people, friends, that live there. This is no joke or fake news. And Boring is very close to Sandy. The second source of data were second and third-hand accounts with no evidence. This was by far the most common. Here's an example here. I found out yesterday that my brother-in-law's friend caught someone putting a mattress in his field and pouring gasoline on it. Then our neighbors tell us her friend caught someone trying to light some taped together M100s in her driveway. So here you can see the different steps in terms of kind of like playing telephone, right? My brother-in-law's friend, our neighbor tells us her friend, thing like that. So let me now turn to the 4 acts. First, Act 1, arson is not climate change. Residents rejected the idea that the fires were linked to global warming. They were very clear that the fires were due to arson and angrily denied that this was due to any naturally occurring phenomena. This one post here says, Q sent me. Let's call this what this really is. This is domestic terrorism by paid mercenaries of the Democrat Party. This is not about climate fires. This is arson. Another one. Yes, these idiots have been running around setting fires, and the mainstream media tries to attribute it to climate change. But we all know the truth. It's extremist groups, Antifa and BLM. Believe what you want, but these fires aren't just popping up out of nowhere by chance. Yes, some start from power lines being down, but this many fires at once happening this broadly is too strange. I think this last point is important. It underscores the unbelievability of the entire situation. It was something most Oregonians had never experienced previously, and the scale and intensity were difficult to fathom. Having said that, it is also true people preferred an interpretation that renders them as the victims of the Democratic Party and Antifa BLM. They are being targeted, and the media is trying to cover it up. Politicians and the mainstream media were protecting the arsonists from blame and prosecution. If this sounds familiar, it should. It is the same logic that we saw with the 2020 election. Zero evidence, false claims, conspiracies, and victimization. This particular instance of climate denial has 3 elements to it. First, there is an unprecedented physical experience. Second, the belief in arson builds on a long history of climate denial on the part of the Republican Party and the right. And third, there was a readily available alternative explanation that aligned with national events. This brings us to Act 2, Antifa BLM. Given that the fires were supposedly due to arson, the question is, who are the arsonists? The answer is Antifa and BLM. Supposedly, they were not just starting fires, but shooting people, looting, and terrorizing rural communities, and for some, the entire US. I'm going to read partially from the next 2 posts here. Any truth to the rumor that these fires have been set? They're reporting that Antifa is starting fires to block exits. Last report is that shots are being fired at evacuees. This is like, I can tell, we're going well beyond arson here. As Antifa BLM set fire to the Pacific Northwest, Joe Biden labeled President Trump a, quote, climate arsonist. Really? What warped reality are the Democrats living in? And lastly, this is a huge escalation of the culture war. Is this eco-terrorism? I believe the Antifa BLM theory is true. This last one is important because the author presents it as a culture war, and in many ways it is. It is a war over the truth, facts, their interpretations, as well as people's values. Now, there was a grain of truth which may have encouraged rural residents to blame BLM and Antifa for the fires. And that was they had set fires in Portland as part of the BLM protests in the summertime. So one could argue that they were not pulling this out of thin air, but they were making wild connections. Who has been rioting? Who has been protesting? Who's been starting fires? Isn't Antifa and BLM who have been saying we're going to, quote, burn it all down? Antifa has been setting fires nightly in Oregon and Washington for the past 100 days. Time to implement the death penalty for arson. And this last one here, Antifa is not a group, as I understand, by listening to its members, but they sure as hell light off a lot of fires in Multnomah County. Just because it is in Corbett and not Portland does not mean it's not them. It's not hard to connect the dots. What was the evidence for the arson? One man was arrested in Washington state. He had been arrested at a BLM protest in 2014. So obviously he must be a member of Antifa. As can be seen, the slightest bits of evidence are seized upon and extrapolated to support the larger narrative. This brings us to Act 3. It's a conspiracy. Soon after the rumors began, law enforcement and the mainstream media began challenging them. They not only refuted the accuracy, but as the rumors grew, they told people to stop spreading them and to listen to official news sources. This gave rise to a larger conspiracy in which the Oregon government, especially Governor Kate Brown, the Democrats, and the media were all in cahoots. Even non-local news sources, such as the New York and Los Angeles Times, were reporting on this, and not always in sympathetic ways, which of course reinforced the bias of the mainstream media. For rural residents, not only were these authoritative sources seeking to protect the arsonists, but this was further evidence that they wanted to see rural Oregon destroyed by Antifa and BLM. There was extensive commentary on Governor Kate Brown and the widespread belief that she and the Oregon state government should be tried for treason. People juxtaposed the fact that she did not go after Antifa with the COVID restrictions in place as evidence of treason. Now, I realize this sounds convoluted, but hopefully the following comment will illustrate the logic. Sad that these people have no idea what's really going on and want to wait after people die and their homes are burned to the ground. Waiting to do something. Oh, and let's keep law-abiding people locked down while you allow others to burn, loot, and murder in private. Like Antifa will obey curfew? Like Antifa will obey laws? Have they yet? So here we can see how other anxieties and anger, completely unrelated to the fires or even the election, manifest in the rumors. And again, we see the false victimization going on. Over on the top one here, it says, this system protects Antifa and BLM terrorists. Imagine the narrative if even one Trump supporter or white supremacist was caught setting fires. We are on our own. Hashtag White Lives Matter. The phrase "we are on our own" is very telling. It indicates a deep disconnect and sense of betrayal on the part of those posting. Nonetheless, the idea that a Trump supporter would be vigorously prosecuted for setting fires is deeply ironic and counter to the evidence. In fact, the vast majority of domestic terrorism is due to white supremacists, according to both the FBI and DHS. Despite this, they have not been pursued for decades. Responding to law enforcement's refutation of arson was difficult because, generally speaking, rural residents support law enforcement, especially in light of the BLM protests. Virtually every law enforcement unit investigated the claims and found no evidence. However, one sheriff did implicate Antifa. Clackamas County Deputy Mark Nicolai publicly stated, quote, "Antifa mother effers are causing hell," unquote. He was quickly put on administrative leave, and the higher-ups issued a statement refuting what he said. Nonetheless, the cat was out of the bag, and his statement fueled even more rumors. And of course, the fact that Nicolai was put on leave was simply more evidence of a cover-up conspiracy. Well, the treason logic is a bit tortured. Dismissing the mainstream media was much easier, as it has been discredited by the right for years due to its supposed liberal bias. Nonetheless, the data indicated that not everyone believed the rumors. There were a handful of individuals who supported law enforcement's findings, but they encountered strong pushback. Listen to the police scanners. Of course, the left-wing media outlets don't want people thinking it's Antifa. This page will probably post next. Antifa was busy all night checking on rural communities, leaving gasoline for returning property owners in case they need it, and inspecting and dusting ash from personal items left behind. Later in the week, they plan to hand out gifts to Portland and surrounding areas. This page is losing its purpose quickly. Need to change the name to Sandy Liberal Bias Information. Ironically, the truth was that BLM did help local communities in response to the fires. They did this in Portland as well as over in Springfield, close to where I live here in Eugene and in other communities. Not only was this not covered, of course, in the post, but those questioning the rumors were ridiculed. When the Oregonian, which is based in Portland, announced that the rumors were false, the response was, "I don't believe the Oregonian for 1 second." So clearly, the mainstream media has zero legitimacy. The final part of the narrative is disbelief. Disbelief that others did not share this entire narrative. They were incredulous that not everyone could see what was so obvious to them. This lack of support precluded the correct public response, which presumably would have been mass arrests of Antifa and BLM members. Q sent me, "Most of these folks are in complete denial of the situation. Deal with the extremists burning down your homes." People's blindness is what is dangerous to this community. Wake up, folks. Bad people doing bad things. So what we have here are people fabricating elaborate conspiracies out of no real evidence and then condemning others who do not agree. This hints at the state of mind of Sandy and other nearby communities. So the question becomes, why did they feel so vulnerable and threatened by imagined terrorists? Why is this happening in Oregon? And how is this connected to white supremacy? Let's start with Oregon. Oregon is considered a liberal state, part of what some call the left coast. It was one of the first to legalize marijuana and has a long history of protest and hippies. It also is an historically white state. Oregon epitomizes the rural-urban divide that characterizes so much of the US these days. Its cities, which are concentrated in the West, are all liberal, while its vast eastern territory, which is sparsely populated, is conservative. Because the cities have the population, power, and wealth, they dominate. The rural areas, which have been abandoned by capital and the state, are impoverished, struggling, and angry. They align perfectly with the Republican Party's politics of grievance. And I'm very much indebted here to the work of my colleagues, Joe Lowndes and Dan Martinez-Hosang, who've done a lot of work thinking through the politics of conservative rural Oregon. Rural Oregon has also, some of you may recall, has been the site of major contestations over federal and state authority. In 2016, the Malheur Wildlife Refuge was occupied by the Bundy family and their followers, ending in a shootout with federal authorities. Moreover, the Pacific Northwest figures prominently in fantasies of a white homeland and ethno-state. Currently, there are at least 3 efforts underway to change state boundaries in order to create a rural, conservative, white Christian state. So in short, contemporary Oregon is a clash of cultures and power imbalances. This has led to Republicans using all kinds of strategies to assert themselves. For example, rather than voting on a climate change bill in 2018, they fled the state, thereby preventing a quorum. And as mentioned earlier, The National Republican Party has denied climate change for decades, but it doubled down on its denial during the Trump administration. There's an important parallel between Trump's claim that climate change is a Chinese hoax and the Oregon wildfire rumors. Both attribute blame to a political foe. This tells us something about the nature of the denial itself. It is a tool to discredit one's enemies. Here we see how climate denial is deeply politicized and embedded in a larger social context unrelated to science, effective communication, and policy. While many scholars are trying to figure out how best to communicate with the public, these rumors suggest that for some, it is not a question of policy and communication. We are way beyond that. It is important to understand the nature of rumors and why they are invoked. Terry Knopf notes that, quote, rumors explain what is not clear, provide details, and above all else, relieve collective tension. Communities like Sandy are facing numerous anxieties and tensions. In addition to economic challenges and fears of a communist takeover, there are very real racial anxieties. Though the US has always been a white supremacist society, the question of its racial nature has been increasingly contested since the civil rights movement of the late 1960s. It is this polarization and contestation over the racial nature of the US that fuels the right's opposition to BLM and its allies. There are many reasons why the right opposes BLM and its supporters, but the fundamental point of contestation is, does structural racism exist in the US? And if so, what is to be done about it? Black Lives Matter threatens the right's view of the US, as well as whites' privileged status, by insisting that racism is a systemic part of the US. The right not only opposes the claim, but also the protests themselves. Denial is central to all of this. It is difficult to overstate the importance of denial to the right's understanding of the US racial formation. Denying the racial violence upon which the US was created has been fundamental to building a viable nation. Because how do you build a nation on the blood and bones of those deemed racially inferior? You either admit the truth, process the trauma, and move on, or you deny it. BLM and its allies' insistence that Black lives actually matter implies that they have not previously mattered, which in turn means that the US has historically overvalued and privileged white lives at the expense of Black lives. Despite a legal apparatus that has upheld white supremacy for centuries, this truth is deeply threatening because it means that the central narrative of the US, that we are a land of equality, freedom, and liberty for all, is untrue. This would create a crisis for the nation, one we have postponed for centuries, and one that BLM brings us ever closer to. The racial anxiety of the right can be seen in the wildfire rumors and the larger climate discourse. The right uses coded organizing frames that are not overtly racist, but which in fact serve to reproduce white supremacy by denying systematic racism. These include terms like communism, patriots, and law and order. I start with communism because it serves as an overarching framework. For the far right, communism and socialism are very real dangers. Many are willing to take up arms to resist those perceived to be working towards Marxism, communism, socialism. While the communist threat did fade with the demise of the Soviet Union, it was rekindled by the Tea Party, China's ascendancy, and the pandemic. BLM and Antifa also fall into this category. To be clear, BLM is not a communist front, but there are members who do identify as socialist. One repeatedly hears that BLM is Marxist and socialist and therefore must be resisted. There is a long history of connecting anti-racism and communism in the US. Communism and socialism were routinely used to delegitimize Black anti-racist activists, as well as Chicanx labor activists and others. Prior to the 21st century, charges of communism and socialism implied foreign interference. During the Cold War, any hint of foreign interference was not tolerated, thereby discrediting any anti-racist activism. This delegitimization had several implications. First, It meant that African Americans were incapable of building effective organizations and movements. Instead, it was assumed that the Soviets were behind US anti-racist campaigns. Second, dismissing anti-racism as a communist plot implies that Black, Indigenous, and people of color were satisfied with their racial status. Supposedly, they had no need or desire to seek change. Today, the right sees BLM and its allies as un-American, and it is incumbent upon true patriots to defend the US. These are all powerful forms of denial, refusing to acknowledge the true nature of the US racism and the legitimate grievances of Black Lives Matter. Another organizing frame is patriot. The term strategically used by Trump to characterize his supporters has gained traction across the right. One commentator said, "I've been doing this every night, stopping at all these checkpoints, meeting more and more patriots. It's awesome." Oh, wait, I got my slides mixed up. Sorry. There's that. And I apologize for the poor quality of some of these. That's like kind of beyond me. Patriot is a powerful ideological term which serves to legitimate and sanitize the far right's racial terror. In August 2020, when 17-year-old Kyle Rittenhouse shot 2 BLM protesters in Kenosha, Wisconsin, he was hailed as a patriot by the right. The right discredits those who disagree with them as being unpatriotic. Those who are unpatriotic have no legitimacy or standing in the body politic. Of course, the millions of BLM supporters are also, by definition, unpatriotic. It is important to understand that people of color can be patriots. In order for people of color to be patriots, they must accept the continued privileging of the white nation. There has always been a segment of Black, Indigenous, and people of color who have chosen such politics. Patriot is a strategic and sufficiently robust term that allows a diversity of people to join the movement. Patriots oppose efforts to create racial justice, and they demonize such activists, labeling them as un-American. We can call it multicultural white supremacy. And again, I draw here on the work of Lowndes and Martinez-Hosang. The final term I consider is law and order. This phrase builds on a long history of connecting cities, crime, and people of color. As noted, Portland was a site of nightly protests, which included looting and fires. However, it is the right that has rammed cars into activists, shot people, used pepper spray on protesters, and engaged in other forms of violence, as we see here. And of course, important to point out, in a place like Portland, the vast majority of protesters at the BLM protests are white people that we're talking about. The counter-protesters claim they are needed because mayors are not controlling the protests. As one leader said, quote, "We're just sick and tired of the lawlessness of 100+ days in Portland. There has to be some accountability," unquote. Nonetheless, a report from the Department of Homeland Security determined that, quote, "the white supremacist extremists will remain the most persistent and lethal threat in the homeland through 2021. And we all saw what happened on January 6th. The law and order frame is filled with contradictions. During the height of the wildfire rumors, one Facebook user posted, quote, "I'm so confused. So are we with law enforcement or no? When we hear defund the police, we're with them. But when the sheriff tells us Antifa is not signifiers, they're the government and not to be believed." Now, one reason for the widespread support of law enforcement is because of its historic role in protecting whiteness, including white property, bodies, and space. The white nation knows this. This generalized support of law enforcement has led to the Back the Blue movement, which we can see here. Here, people are not only supporting the police, but they're actively resisting calls for racial justice. So, to conclude, I have tried to explain why rural Oregonians circulated rumors regarding wildfires this past fall. I have argued that the rumors constitute two forms of denial: climate denial and racial denial. While the climate denial is readily apparent, the racial denial is the anxiety and anger undergirding this historical moment for the right. In no way would I suggest that racism is the only issue fueling the right. There are many reasons why it feels it is facing an existential crisis, including real economic and political concerns. But it is also true that white supremacy is one of the engines that drives the US nation. Too often, those of us working in the field of environmental justice focus on disparate impacts or other inequalities. Well, very important. The white rage associated with white supremacy can impact many parts of our world in unanticipated ways. It is a powerful ideology built into the DNA of the US. The desire to preserve a white nation, which can only occur through the reproduction of white supremacy, is a seemingly uncontrollable force. We ignore it at our own peril. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laura. That was great. Audience members, I invite and encourage you to put some questions into the chat. Anthony, do you want to take the first question here?
Sure, that sounds good. So Mark says that he's fascinated by the crisis that USA is not exceptional in the ways that Europeans have been able to align with more power relative to BIPOC. Do you see any strains within Eastern Oregon residents to confront this crisis in a meaningful way? And yeah.
Do I see ways to confront the crisis of racism in Eastern Oregon?
I think that's what he's asking.
Well, there's a couple more. Why don't you read go ahead and read the whole thing? Yeah.
Oh, should I read all of it? Okay.
Yeah.
I'm just going to repeat the question then. Do you see any strains within Eastern Oregon residents to confront this crisis in a meaningful way? Do you see the problematics of settlerism, how capital has abandoned them, how the church has been blind to injustices? And he mentions that in his experience, there are hints of these in rural California, but these conversations are often overlooked.
Yeah, as I was doing this work, I know that they are definitely parallels in Northern California as well. So it's not unique totally at all to Oregon. Gosh, I don't know. I mean, on the one hand, I have to acknowledge there is a group called ROP, Rural Organizing Project, which actually takes it upon themselves to go into rural communities and to do anti-racist work. So I think that's really important. I don't know what they've been doing this past year because of the pandemic, right? And how they've been impacted in that way, but I know they've been doing incredibly important work. I have to say, I'm really not hopeful right now at this particular moment about how these problems can be addressed. I mean, the split that we see in so many places is very geographically and socially pronounced here. And, you know, we are not living in the same kind of media worlds. And the divisions just are really pretty intense. You know, in parts of Eastern Oregon, there's regular militias that are mobilizing. You can see them out drilling and practicing out on the highways, and it's pretty intense. Yeah, I don't have any ready. I mean, I think I have been saying for the past year that I think that it's kind of we're heading like towards a civil war. And I don't think it's going to be a civil war like the first civil war in the US, but more kind of like low intensity conflict, like we have seen like in Central America for many years.
That's actually a great lead into the next question. Austin, do you want to take that?
Absolutely. So Michael asks, when this kind of denial becomes institutionalized and is widely shared in communities, how can it be unwound?
I don't know. I will say I've been following and reading a lot about climate denial, particularly among evangelicals and other conservative Christians. And, you know, some of the strategies they have been using is, you know, first identifying what are the points of doubt or that people have, and then having people that they trust and that they would believe come and address those kinds of issues. So I just think it's incredibly important for, particularly for evangelicals and Christians who believe in climate change, to take a leadership role in terms of trying to address that with their communities and in their congregations. And I think we see similar things with the vaccine, right? And hearing the information from a credible news source, which certainly would not be anybody like me, right? I have numerous strikes going against me. So, I've long felt that when people ask about white supremacy, and how do we change it? It's a responsibility that we all have, but it's one that falls particularly hard on white people. And they have the onus for that because they can get the inroads into that community and they can be heard in a way that people of color cannot be heard, right? So it really is incumbent on them to speak up.
Mm-hmm. Anthony, do you want to read the next question from Suyapa?
Yeah, so Suyapa has a question, and she'd just like to welcome you and thank you for coming here to speak to us today. And her question regards what do you
Don't
consider?
Forget her mother says hello.
Oh, sorry. Her mother Olga says hello.
Most important piece there.
Sorry, I forgot to say that. So her question surrounds, what do you consider were the barriers to real change in LA since the 1992 uprisings? What were some of the opportunities and challenges since then in LA uprising? And why does racial and economic justice still elude us in LA despite all our organizing?
Thank you for that easy question, Suyapa. One of the things that I really have been thinking about is I'm thinking about the Biden administration, and I'm hearing about the different appointments that they're making in cabinet positions and different kinds of administrative posts, which have all been, obviously not only a welcome change from the Trump administration, but it's reminiscent to me of after 92. And I remember after 92 about the creation of kind of the RLA, the Rebuilding LA board, which just became so massive, right? Because everybody wanted representation. It was so important to get this segment of the population, this community in by demographics. And which is not to say it shouldn't be inclusive. Obviously it should, but again, I think we can, there's too much of a risk of going down to the path of a politics of representation in terms of thinking about some of the fundamental kinds of changes that are required. And I also remember the case in 1992, it was all right, can we build a market? Can we get private capital to go into South LA and to build a market? I mean, and that was just a really daunting challenge, right, to happen for decades. And so again, how much, I think this is an interesting question, the public-private kind of partnership, the relying on capital when, that might not be in the interest of capital, right? And at what expense does the private have to pay for that and support that? So I'm in some ways, I'm a little encouraged. I'm thinking again, parallels with, the Biden administration around the infrastructure thing, when at the very least, at least they're willing to do a jumpstart, right? In terms of certain kinds of technologies and infrastructure, which will help make a leap. And I don't know that I saw that with the 1992, uprising. The other thing I would say too is, at that time, it was, shortly thereafter, I think that we begin to see a real uptake in labor organizing in the LA area. If I have my time right, it had started, and I think that was a really important part missing from the table. There was such an focus on terms of certain forms of capital, rich financiers who could come and take the lead as our saviors and stuff like that. So it wasn't a bottom-up strategy. It was more of a, kind of top-down directing capital to fix the problem kind of strategy.
It's funny, I was thinking a lot about 92 when you were speaking, and I think there's a lot of similarities in terms of people. It's basically sort of the inability to see, you can't see or understand what it is that is causing people to mobilize collectively as they did in 92. You can't see what it's causing people to mobilize collectively, in a concerted way. Obviously George Floyd was a catalyst for this, but the simultaneity of the protests and so forth are impossible for people to explain because we're so used to thinking in these very top-down ways. And I think that that similar kind of lack of ability to see clouds our ability to perceive, climate change. We just can't see that there's a single cause. People want to have a single cause, like a single way of understanding, X leads to Y. And similarly, that the Black Lives Matter protests were also just inexplicable to people because they don't understand anarchic movement of any kind. They don't understand. And I think that anarchic movement is very similar also to like ecological, the sort of lateral connectivity that, ecosystems can have in as they're growing increasingly reactive in the time of climate change. So it's a very interesting question to me about 92 that it came up because it was definitely on my mind. And I guess I was wondering, I have many questions for you, but I guess I'll ask you, there is this sort of tension that you've outlined between, hierarchy on the one hand, leadership like Trump, and then this sort of like lateral constituency of the people who are buying into the discourse. Like, Trump is deploying it for political purposes. And then there's all these people who just buy into it. And it seems to me there's always like a tension there, and embedded in that tension is rumor, like as a method, as a practice, a way of being or something. I know it's a kind of a convoluted question, but I wanted to say it because it was sort of percolating there. And then Suyapa's question really brought it to the surface for me with the 92 thing as well.
Asking about rumor?
Take it however you want.
I thought rumor is really interesting, and I'm drawing on the work here of is it Manu Karuka's book Empire's Tracks, and he talks about rumor and the role of rumor in empire. And I was really taken with that, because because before this I just thought, oh, rumor, how ridiculous, it's crazy. But when you think about it, it's a huge part of social relationships, communication, mobilization, rumor. It's really quite big. And so this is the first time I've thought about rumor, but I'm really interested in it, I have to say. We see it at this moment in time because there is so little lack of faith by many people in our institutions and in our leaders, that is supplanted by rumor, right? That stands in for it, or that's become one of the strategies of coping with it. And I also thought it's really important, I had that quote by Terry Knopp, it relieves collective tension. And that's certainly something that we saw and felt in Oregon during the fires. Tremendous kinds of tension. And there were two, right? There was the pandemic that had been going on. And then there was the fires. And I mean, it was just,
yeah. I
don't have how, I wasn't threatened. I mean, nearest fire for me was like 17 miles away, but it was just like, 17 minutes away, but it was exhausting. It was just like, I can't believe this is happening to us, after all of these difficulties. So there's a lot of tension.
Austin, do you want to take the next question from Urmi?
So Urmi asks, thank you for this incredible presentation. And the question is, could you speak about how you think that resistance to public health advice and anti-vaccination beliefs relate to your work on climate denial and denial of systemic racism among white conservatives?
There's two ways in which I think that they're linked. One is it's the logic of it. It is absolutely the same logic we saw around the election, the same logic around vaccines, the same logic around the fires, right? They follow very similar kinds of patterns if you kind of deconstruct them as different forms of discourses and actions and mobilizations. So there's something going on in our world that is leading to these similar kinds of patterns. The second thing I would say is that I read recently that different right, particularly like QAnon and other far right kinds of news sources, and I don't know what you call them. I wouldn't know if I call it a movement, but they are, or online kind of movements, are now shifting to the vaccine, right? So it's like, all right, so the election, all right, it didn't happen, on March 4th, January 6th, whatever date you choose, Trump did not come back to be the president. So where else do we funnel our energies now? And so it's moving to anti-vaxxing now. So it just picks up for the next thing.
Anthony?
So Greg says that Eastern Oregon politics and rural Oregon politics differ.
I'll go. Can you start again, Anthony?
Oh, did I cut out?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. So Ginny mentioned that Eastern Oregon politics greatly from.
Let me read it. You keep cutting out.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry.
Okay. So Eastern Oregon politics and rural Oregon politics differ greatly from major cities like Portland and Eugene. Portland is experiencing a decline in citizens wanting to live there based on violence and political beliefs. Businesses are not able to function downtown as they have in the past. The politics have divided the city and the state, and the stress it has created on Portland might be too hard to recover from. How does Oregon move forward?
Oh, I don't agree that it's too hard to recover from. And you're absolutely right that it's very different, rural Oregon from Portland, Eugene, Salem. And that's what creates such divisions within the state. They're like planets, removed from each other, right? So they're very, very different. And this is also not to say, I wouldn't want to say that there are no, consequences or impacts from the protests going on there. On the other hand, actually, we do see a lot of people still wanting to move into Portland. It is becoming, it's a magnet city in many different kinds of ways, but there's certainly, I'm sure, people there who don't appreciate what is going on and the downtown businesses. I don't know what the solution is going to be, to what is going on in terms of Portland per se, in terms of the protests. The governor has continued to say that she supports people's right to protest. I think one of the things that made it more antagonistic and even created more levels of protest in Portland was also when there was the federal presence, if you recall this past summer, right, when different federal troops were brought in by the Trump administration. And it was really, an important kind of show of force that we were seeing, right? We were not going to let you do this. We're going to crack down on this, and for all kinds of different reasons. And that just fueled more protests and more kind of antagonisms and splits. So I don't know. I mean, hopefully that won't happen anymore, but I don't know what's going to happen in Portland. It's a really interesting thing. I think that both Portland and Seattle, there's these, two interesting cities that they have a great deal in common. And I think they're infinitely fascinating in terms of their racial politics, because they are kind of identified as these kind of like left cities that are overwhelmingly white cities. And so where does that go and how will that be addressed? I don't know. I think another important issue to think about too is also the houselessness problem going on in Portland, which is another major problem that there, again, lots of contestation and conflict around, and people feeling it affects their quality of life, in all kinds of ways, but a larger unwillingness to deal with the roots of those problems. So I don't know the answer to your question. Yeah,
kind of feeds well into the next question. Austin, do you want to take that?
Absolutely. So Joanna says, fascinating talk. Do you have any thoughts on how these rumors fit in a broader historical context of people in the American West blaming fires on alleged arsonists, often believing to be homeless or poor people? This seems to be a recurring pattern since at least the early 20th centuries, when so-called tramps and hobos were blamed.
That's a really interesting question. And I haven't thought about that. But one of the things that I will say is that there's a really important difference between a human caused fire and arson. So there are lots of fires which are caused by people who are camping, for example, and they let their campfire smolder, and then conditions change and boom, you got a big fire. And you could see similar things certainly with houseless people causing fires in that way. And I think that's a very different thing from arson, and that being a deliberate, malicious effort to create a fire versus all these other human caused kinds of fires. So I would make that important distinction. You know, the question about being tramps and hobos, I think that is another interesting layer that you introduced to it, because both of them are people that are seen as socially other, right, from the potentially impacted communities. So we saw this in the case of Antifa BLM as certainly being other to rural communities, and we see those in the case of the tramp hobos as well. That's a really interesting question that I'll think a lot more about. Thank you.
Anthony, you want to try for the last question here?
Yeah, that sounds good. So Tracy mentions that she lives in Bend, Oregon, and she mentions that Oregon is such a contrast of belief systems. Can you please comment on the white supremacists who are being radicalized in prisons in Oregon? These are generally like poor white men who feel powerless. Do you think programs like Brother Greg Boyles, founder of Homeboy and Homegirl, who help gang members with therapy and jobs, works to change white supremacy? And they also have a question about Biden's infrastructure bill and whether your thoughts on whether it creates jobs and retraining.
Another easy question. I don't know what is happening in the Oregon prisons. I do have a colleague who works in them, does a lot of work in the prisons. And in fact, I'm going to start teaching in the prisons. We have a very big prison outreach program here at the U of O. And interestingly, they have really been recruiting a lot of BIPOC faculty to go into the prisons in terms of, and I think the logic is we want to really serve like the indigenous folks in the prison, the Latinx people, which of course are disproportionately represented in the prison. So I understand the logic for that. But I hadn't thought about, what is happening in that, but of course that would make perfect sense. And that happens in many other prisons I know. So that makes perfect sense. I don't know. I know I am familiar with Homeboy Industries and Father Boyle's work, his legendary kind of work. And I don't know that it would exist in the same way. I think one of the central things that we need to do is there's many reasons that people feel disenfranchised and demoralized and are rageful in rural areas. And we have to deal with those things, whatever they are. I mean, this will not end until that is addressed and resolved. And some of those things, I know, like from left-view position, people say, oh, well, they lost all the jobs and blah, blah, blah. And that's not untrue. They are places of tremendous hardship. And, if you're from Eastern Oregon, you've driven through it, you'll see, you go through rest stops and there's no running water, there's no flushing toilets. I mean, it's a poor place. There's places where there is no 911, right? So it's in many ways been abandoned by many part, capital and the state to a certain address. So there's those issues that need to be addressed, absolutely, in terms of how do you support economically and provide the services needed in rural areas. Having said that, I don't think that's sufficient to actually address what's going on. I think what's happening in rural Oregon is also part of a much larger kind of movement around white supremacy and the white nation, white people feeling that they're losing control of the nation through democratic change, through growing political movement and empowerment, the part of Black, Indigenous, Latinx people, immigration, all those kinds of issues like that. So that's been our central struggle for centuries. That has been the struggle for centuries. And every time there has been progress made in the way of human rights, civil rights, anti-racism, there has been the white backlash. There's been the white rage. We saw that in Reconstruction. We saw that after the civil rights movement, and we're seeing it now. So maybe that is our way in the United States is, we take, one step forward, 5 steps back, that kind of thing like that. But it's not going to go away until those issues are addressed. And that's going to be very long, I think, and painful process here.
I mean, it kind of, your comments just sort of encapsulated, I think, 2 of the remaining questions. And then there's a third question, the questions about white supremacy, resorting to conspiracy theories, the invisibility of white supremacy and this growing conflict in the United States. And the question is like, what kinds of political allies might be useful to counter those kinds of conflicts? And then the next question, also just feeding right into what you're saying, is what do you think is going to happen next? You know, like, are things going to get worse before they get better? Or are we at the peak of the backlash before we kind of process the trauma that you spoke about at the beginning? Maybe you could take those two together, and then we can ask the last question if there's time.
Yeah, I don't think it's going to, we are not at the peak. I think it will continue to, as I said, I think there's going to be like, so just last Friday or something, there was a car trying to ram into the Capitol, kill the police officer there, right? I don't know why this happened, but it certainly looks to be like an attack on the state. I think that's a fair thing to say, you know, about that. So I think we're going to continue to see that. We're going to continue to see domestic terrorism of various sources, unplanned or not. I mean, it's planned, but it'll be surprising to all of us when and how it shows up, and people will continue to die, I think, in various kinds of ways. You know, it could be something that will last maybe a couple of years until maybe people get exhausted through it, or until we're willing to, I mean, part of it has to be the state clamping down on it. I mean, one of the reasons it's gotten so out of control is because, and this has been well documented, the state, federal government and states have spent enormous resources pursuing groups like Antifa and Black Lives Matter rather than paying attention to white terrorism. And so hopefully we'll begin to, that will shift. And I think that's really important to begin decapitating, as it were, these kinds of movements. So hopefully that will happen. So that's one part of the situation. I think another part is hopefully, you know, somebody asked about, you know, creating different job opportunities for people. But again, it's not just poor people doing this. So that is part of the solution, but it's not the entire solution. And then, you know, can we get to a place as a society that at least wants to acknowledge multicultural democracy? You know, that just seems to be too much for some people to entertain and embrace. But that's where we have to get to.
I think we're going to leave it there. That was really beautifully said and a great note to end on. And I want to take a moment to thank Austin and Anthony for helping to field the questions, and Sunrise Claremont for co-hosting this event. I'd also, again, like to thank the Rockefeller Brothers Fund for sponsoring the illustrious Laura Pulido, professor at U of O. And thank you, Laura, so much for your time. I'd also, actually, before we leave, would like to thank John Morgan and IT for helping to set this up, in our communications department for helping to spread the word. Really appreciate you. Thank you to our audience members and all the people who asked amazing questions. We obviously could have gone on for much, much longer, but it's a pleasure speaking with you as always, Laura Polito. Thank you so much.
Thank you.